So I am Elena Di Giovanni. I am Associate Professor of Translation and Accessibility at the University of Macerata in Italy, and I am also the President of ESIST, the European Association for Studies in Screen Translation.
Yes, my name is Agnieszka Szarkowska. I'm a professor at the University of Warsaw and Vice President of ESIST. And together...
My name is Mary Carroll.
That's right. And we are going to introduce Mary. So Mary, you are a co-author together with Jan Iverson of probably the first book on subtitling. I have it here on my shelf, as well as the Code of Good Subtitling Practice, which for many years was the ultimate standard for subtitling. In 2012, you received the Jan Iverson Award for your lifelong achievements in the field of subtitling, and also for bringing together the professional world of audiovisual translation and academia. And today we wanted to go back in time a little bit, and let us start with how your audiovisual translation journey began.
Well, that goes back quite a long time, I suppose. I started doing subtitling as one of the areas within a small company that I had founded for translation. And then over the course of the 1980s, audiovisual translation in the form of subtitling and some voiceover became more prevalent. So by the late 80s, I was doing subtitling at that time with the regional television station, mainly for productions that were to go to festivals, video festivals mainly, or for sales purposes. And at that time, to do subtitling, you had a room which was maybe 25, 30, 40 square meters with big 1-inch tapes. And you worked with a technician in order to get the time codes into this big machine. You viewed the tape beforehand, went away, did your subtitles, got them per hand manually into the system, and then adjusted time codes. For a production of maybe 90 minutes, it took about 3 weeks. So that was how I started off in subtitling. And then at the end of the 80s, the first subtitling equipment was available. I think PCs basically revolutionized how you could go about subtitling with electronic time codes, etc. So in the late 1980s, I had purchased the first Cavina scan titling subtitling systems. And then in 1990, I started a new company, which was Titelbild, exclusively then for subtitling and audiovisual translation. And that was really the start of, basically a professional life in subtitling and AVT. So they were the early days.
And you met Jan Iverson?
Yes, because I didn't know so very much about subtitling, I thought. And in order to gain a lot more experience, and because the regional television station had asked me also to conduct courses for them, we were already conducting courses for our own subtitlers by the early 90s. And I had myself invited to Australia, to the special broadcasting service in Australia, because they had been subtitling professionally since 1980. And I spent several weeks at SBS Australia, and they were extremely generous with their materials and with their time. And that gave me a solid foundation for the courses that I was supposed to be running then for professionals from developing countries as part of the Television Training Center of SFB Berlin. That was for the German government, for their programs for developing countries. And I wanted to benefit also for the courses that we were running at Titelbild. Lots of university people came to those courses, as well as the subtitlers that we were training for our own productions. And as part of that program, I contacted Jan Iversen because by then, this could have been around 1993, I was familiar with his book, and I thought it would be very good to get an outside professional coming into those courses. And that's how we met. I was very impressed with his book at the time, and he was a professional working in the field in Europe. And that was the start of a long collaboration and friendship between Jan Iversen and myself. It was during our discussions that we then decided to write a new book, which was published in 1998. And as part of our discussions, we formed this code of good subtitling practice, which we published in the book and which ESIST endorsed then in 1998.
Mary, your career, and you've been already talking about it, in audiovisual translation is quite unique. I think you've been a professional, you set up a company, you've been an inspiration to researchers, and we've just found out that you've been also instrumental in setting up professional training that also attracted people from the academic world. And you've also been the co-founder of possibly the most important series of conferences for audiovisual translation and media accessibility that is still running. Do you think it has been, and it still is, important to join professional knowledge and academic work or involvement in the academic community, and how?
I think it is definitely important. It is important, I think, to benefit from the research projects that academia can further. And I think that for academics, it is interesting to hear about the problems in the practical world, and also to possibly test out the results of applied research. So I think it is a win-win situation, definitely of mutual benefit. Yeah, yes. I think dialogue and networking is extremely important.
Yeah, and training is in between, isn't it? Because if we share as academics and professionals, if we share a common space, then training is beneficial for professionals and for academics.
Definitely. And I think that audiovisual translation took this path. I think it's quite well known that in the professionalization of any sphere, that very often it goes from the practice to the research to academics. I think I never would have started doing training so intensively had we been able to recruit subtitlers who had been university trained. The people we were training principally for our own use, quite apart from the academics who then came to learn about it in order to develop courses at universities. We needed training for basically trained interpreters. Later, when we started doing live subtitling, we drew principally on interpreters for that particular type of live subtitling, as we found they were more suitable than some of the subtitlers who were very good at the written language, but not so good at spoken language. But yes, I do think that there's a great scope and that there's a great need for this collaboration.
Speaking of the collaboration between the industry and the academia, perhaps we can go back in time a little bit. We were hoping you share some insights into how ESIST was established, the European Association for Studies in Screen Translation. You were instrumental in developing all this together with a number of colleagues. Could you tell us a little bit more how it started, what your goals were, what was the atmosphere of the time, etc.?
Yeah, I think in the 90s, especially around the mid-90s, subtitling in particular, but AVT in general, really took off. Around it would have been 1995. There was Yeah, I think ESIST basically was formed originally in 1995. In the March of 1995, there would have been the meeting of about 15 representatives from various universities who met in Cardiff in Wales. I think it was at the instigation of Herwin James, and Yves Gombier was also very much involved. And David Thorne himself wasn't into AVT, but he was very much into Welsh language and Welsh linguistics. And as a result of that, the idea of ESIST came about. Then about 3 months later, there would have been a big meeting in Strasbourg. And again, Yves Gombier was very instrumental in that meeting, and it was endorsed, or yeah, you could say endorsed by FIT and also by the newly formed ESIST. They were also present. And I was part of a roundtable with Herwin James on training. Also, there would have been others, Peter Spoor from the Netherlands and Jean-Alexandre from Strasbourg were also on that roundtable about training for subtitling. And it was at that meeting that I met Herwin and Yves, and they were promoting ESIST. And ESIST was officially formed then in, I think it was the June of 1996. And at the time, it was very difficult to establish something like a foundation or an association. It was difficult in other countries, and it was difficult to set up a bank account unless you had some sort of statutes. And this is how it came about, that it was set up in Cardiff at the University of Lampeter, the campus, Lampeter campus. And David Thorne kindly agreed to be the director, and Herwin kindly agreed to be the secretary. And they stayed in those roles, those official roles, until I think 2011 and 2014 respectively. And Herwin especially was very active in the early years. And it was absolutely necessary to have people in the UK who were registered as the official address. The University of Lampeter was the official address, or the University of Cardiff campus, Lampeter. And yeah, they were, I think I was part of the original board. I think I was treasurer. Herwin was president of the, Yves Gombier was vice president. Yeah, and Josephine Dries was secretary, I think. I was treasurer. And Herman Brondale from Ghent University was the other member of the ESIST board.
Some names have remained right in AVT, whereas some other people, I think, went some other ways.
Josephine moved out of audiovisual altogether, and Herman Brondale retired. Yves took over as president later on. Yeah, that's yes, the march of time. And I think many of those ones in the early years will now be retiring. And yeah, so maybe it's a good idea to capture certain things in interviews.
Yeah, I wonder if we have anyone at the University of Cardiff doing research in audiovisual translation these days. I don't think we have anyone in ESIST, which is interesting. We should approach the University of Cardiff, you know, because they seem to have been so important in setting up.
I think, as many of these things, it's very dependent on individual persons. And Herwin was interested in it in particular because she was subtitling into Welsh from English. Right. So she was a practitioner as well as teaching at university. That's why I think David Thorne was not actually in AVT, and Herwin would have been the motor behind it. And I know that she kept subtitling for many, many years. Possibly she still is, although she too would now be retirement age.
It just occurred to me how much ESIST has grown. It started being called European Association, right? And now we have members all over the world, but still we have the name, right? So
yeah,
we want to keep
I think even from the beginning, even though the name was European, it was never really restricted to Europe. And I think from the very outset, it encouraged membership from further abroad, as evidenced also with the attempt to outreach for the ESIST Subtitling Project at the turn of the century.
Yes, perhaps this is something you can tell us a little bit more about, the ESIST Subtitling Project. I don't think we know enough about it with new members joining in. I don't think we have, like a clear idea. What was it exactly? What was done? What did you try to achieve with it? What was done?
I think the original idea for this project probably came about through my exposure to the tapes that were produced as a result of the 1987 European Broadcasting Union meeting on dubbing and subtitling. As part of that conference, which took place in Stockholm in 1987, attended by public broadcasters, as those meetings always were. 13 or 14 or 15 countries produced a clip of the soap Dallas.
Right.
And I was lucky enough to see these versions of Dallas and was absolutely amazed at how different the standards were in different countries.
Could you tell us a little bit more about that? What was different exactly?
Everything was different. The fonts were different, the colors were different, how they interpreted was different, the length of lines, the number of lines, the number of characters. There was very little that you could say was really similar.
So there was no interaction between the different companies locally providing subtitling?
These were different countries rather than different companies as such. No, there was no interaction. And also the way they interpreted things. I can still remember one particular phrase that had to be, or one particular sentence that had to be subtitled in that was, you can take the girl out of Dallas, but you can't take Dallas out of the girl. And the many different ways that this was interpreted, I found mind-boggling at the time. This was soon after 1987. And this whole project stayed in my mind. And then by the turn of the century, it was when DVD was approaching. DVD had been developed. It wasn't really well known. That didn't come till possibly 2004 or so. And I hit on the idea that it would be excellent to investigate what is the status of subtitling in various countries, or in as many countries as we could possibly access at the turn of the century, before DVD really took hold and sort of blotted out individual countries' norms and conventions, or conventions and norms.
I wanted to ask about that because you have touched upon a very important issue, that is standardization on the one hand and let's say local traditions on the other hand. Could you perhaps comment on this a little bit, and also how the Code of Good Subtitling Practice fits into that?
The Code of Good Subtitling Practice was an attempt to standardize, in a way, the norms that we considered were good subtitling practice at the time, and to have a basis from which research could then investigate the various practices that we had considered were important. It was never meant as a Bible in that sense. It was meant as an aid for training and in a way to counteract some of the not such good practices that we were observing from different other countries. At that stage, Jan had had a lot of experience subtitling and developing subtitling for Swedish public television. And we were very open, actually, to having these quasi conventions or norms tested in research. The Code of Good Subtitling Practice was, of course, around about the same time as the idea was developing for the 2000 ESIST Subtitling Project. ESIST was very open to this idea, and also I knew that if this idea were to be launched by a company, even though the company which I had formed, which was Titelbild, did all of the setting up and the coordination of the project, but of course it needed an international body behind it for other companies and public broadcasters and subtitling agencies to react. And it was an interesting project. I think it still is an interesting project. I think it did provide materials for teaching at universities. It did provide materials for master's theses. I think a PhD also. I think the material
I was wondering
is there.
If somebody's interested, could they still go and research, all those different subtitles that were produced for this video material? Is it like...
Definitely, because the materials were at Titelbild in Berlin for many years. And when Titelbild was, I was very keen for the materials to stay in ESIS's hands, and they were transferred then to Stockholm University.
Right.
I think at the time when Jan Petersen actually was working on his PhD, but they are all still stored they were digitized, and they are stored at Stockholm University. I'm sure they must still be there.
So that would be quite an interesting project to look into, how things have changed, right?
Definitely,
One interesting aspect of all of this is that we seem to be talking about ages ago, but it's 25 years ago.
Yeah.
So many things have changed, and it's unbelievable. And I guess it's the technological side, again, of media that really has changed the whole landscape: training, research, broadcasting, the production of translations, and so on. But again, we're going back in time 25 years. So it's...
Yes, but much has happened in those 25 years. Digitization, of course.
Yeah.
This is what revolutionized. And that is, I think, the significance of the ESIST Subtitling Project. And this was the whole concept behind it, to try and post. This is what things were like before digitization. These were the standards. These were the norms and conventions in different countries.
Yeah.
I think altogether 48 individual cassettes were returned as part of that project.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, there were, it was a lot. It was a lot of cassettes that were sent out. We have a list of countries that actually returned the cassettes. They were Argentina, Australia, Austria, Belgium, Brazil, Croatia, Denmark, England, France, Finland, Germany, Greece, the Netherlands, Iceland, India, Ireland, Israel, Italy, Portugal, Scotland, Slovenia, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, and Wales.
That's a lot.
Impressive.
Yeah. And tapes were returned in 18 languages from 25 different countries.
Amazing. Ranging from India to Croatia. It's amazing. Really.
Yeah. And at the time we took English as the source language,
Right.
because English was being universally used, not only as a result of productions that were coming out of the United States, but we had thought that that would be the language that most countries would be able to subtitle from.
Right.
And yeah, so all that material is still available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We should try and
So encourage everyone to look into this, especially those who are interested in historical research.
Yeah.
I'd like to go back to something that you said, that you were involved in training subtitlers. What do you think has changed in terms of the need, like what do we need to train the subtitlers now? Or did we have to train subtitlers in back when you started, apart from technological things, which obviously, make a huge difference. But in terms of skills, perhaps, I'm wondering, what would you say is the most important for subtitling training?
I think language skills. At the time, in many countries, I think that language skills in the mother tongue were not being as trained as well as perhaps translation skills. But I think to be a good subtitler in particular, for any sort of AVT translation or any form of translation, you certainly need language skills in your mother tongue. And I felt at the time this was not being given enough attention. I would consider it still a very important skill for today. I think one of the big things that has changed, and you just touched on it yourself, is of course how to cope with the technology and how to use the technology that is available. If I compare the technology and how you had to go about it to the early days of subtitling, then I think to be competitive today, you need to embrace all the tools that are being made available and not to neglect your own language skills at the same time. But any training course these days, I think, has to incorporate both aspects in order to make it viable.
Things that we tell our students still today more and more. And when it comes to subtitling, I don't know if Agnieszka has the same kind of feeling. Students get all passionate about the constraints, the technical side of subtitling, and then condensation and chunking and all of that, the 6-second rule, and they tend to forget language issues. So it's great that you say that language competence is absolutely central, regardless of time, and still remain, and also in our mother tongue, which is not something to be taken for granted at all. So.
No, absolutely necessary.
Can I just, I think we're almost towards the end of this great conversation. Can I just take you back in time once again? And perhaps we can talk about some of the key conferences that helped establishing audiovisual translation in its early days. I know there have been a few essential ones.
Yeah, I'd say at the beginning of this road would have been the Strasbourg meeting. It was excellent for networking and bringing academia and practitioners together. The European Institute for the Media held several conferences in the 90s. Again, excellent for networking and the exchange of information. I'm a great believer in networking and in exchange of knowledge. Those conferences were, well, the European Institute for the Media had originally been based in Manchester and had moved to Düsseldorf in Germany. And they had quite a good media library. In fact, it was probably the first place where there was a collection of literature on audiovisual translation. At that time, Josephine Dries was a researcher, a young researcher at the Institute, and she was the convener or one of the main people involved in convening these conferences. There was an important one in Elunda on Crete. There was another one in the Netherlands. I know we visited Hilversum when it was in the Netherlands. And then probably following on from that would have been the launch of the Languages and the Media conferences. That would have been also, again, like ESIST, 1996. The Languages and the Media conference was always important because it was it still is a biennial conference, and it succeeded in picking up on, well, pioneering new ideas. I think like bringing subtitling for the deaf and hard of hearing into mainstream, that was one of the things that Languages and the Media did. Also, audio description was taken on board very, very early. Sign language interpreting for the media, interpreting for the media, DVD. I can recall when DVD was introduced at Languages and the Media that many, many people in the audience, especially academics, had never heard of DVD. There was a huge discussion about what did DVD mean. And so these conferences have also been most important in bringing together academia and practitioners and the industry, software developers, for example. Then in 2004, Jorge Dias-Sintas ran the In So Many Words conference in London, which was highly successful. And again, it brought many, many academics who were at that time just starting in audiovisual translation, and together with many who were already quite established, who had been doing it for the past decade. That could be said to be followed by the Transmedia series. And that too is a biennial conference. Unlike Languages and the Media, which is always in Berlin, Transmedia has moved internationally. It went from Barcelona, Antwerp, London, Leiria in Portugal, across to Australia, back to Stockholm. That has been also very important, especially in involving also media accessibility to interlingual and other forms of AVT. Yeah, and I guess I've been involved in both Languages and the Media and in Transmedia. In Languages and the Media on the steering committee, I think since the outset, and also Transmedia as one of the Transmedia research group. Yeah, but I think those are the principal conferences that have extended beyond national boundaries. There are many, many very important conferences such as Unlimited, which are now specific to particular areas of audiovisual translation. But those two conferences, Transmedia series and Languages and the Media, cover the entire spectrum and bring together many, many people, I think, from all over the world, which is to be hoped will again be in person and not hybrid conferences or online as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah,
absolutely. Let's all hope for that.
Yes, I think that's a great hope to close the interview with. Hoping to see each other in person very soon.
That would be lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your interest.
Thank you
Thank you,
so
Mary.
much.
Thank you for your
Bye-bye now.
time and sharing
Thank you.
all the
It was great.
insights. Thanks a lot.
Lovely
Thank
to
you.
see you.